In today's level up, I'll be showing you how to create a Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom inspired energy ribbon effect in Unreal Engine. Let's get started. Hi, my name is Gregory and I'm a senior VFX artist at Beyond Effects, and for today's level up, you're gonna learn a little bit of material, Niagara, and mainly focusing on making ribbons out of that. So the first thing we're going to check here are the textures we're going to be using for replicating that effect. First thing would be having like the texture for the trails themselves, and you see them, they have like kind of like a wobbly shape, a little bit of variation on them. So to not only have like one trail always and have like an obvious repetition there, I made a couple of them and we're going to pick them randomly on the shader. The other thing is a distortion texture. We're gonna use to add a little bit of details here and there, and a mask or some kind of like really soft pearly noise. And we packed them all together on this texture, and so just for the sake of optimization. So I can show a little bit more of how I made this texture. To make the trails, it's just like a very simple combination of nodes here. You start with the linear gradient and you just increase the tiling so you have a bunch of lines. You tweak their levels so you can make them a little bit thinner. And using a pearly noise, you can use the multi-directional warp grayscale, and that I use the chain mode with 4 directions, and I just played with the intensity and with the randomness of the noise to come up with this one. And to add a little bit of more details, I warped that a little bit more again and blended them together using the max blending mode. If we look at the texture here, you can see that just by blending them using the max mode, you get somewhat like a procedural look to the shapes. So what we do, we blend them a little bit, like we blur them a little bit, and we use the simple trick of like getting the invert grayscale and applying that to a slope blur to get a little bit more defined shapes. So if we look at this part, for example, instead of having a very procedural look, they look a little bit more organic. So we put that on the red channel, and here for the deformation that we're going to use for the shader, I just grabbed the pearly noise, got a normal out of that using the DirectX mode, just because it's in Unreal. If you're going to be making that in Unity, you probably want to use the OpenGL. And then I split that. You only get like the red and the G channels because those are the relevant ones that I'm going to be using. Put them on the pack here. And then I get a slightly bigger pearly noise. I'm going to explain on the shader later why exactly I did that. So we end up with this texture, we export that, and we hop in straight into Unreal. This is what the effect's looking like. If you look at the trails, you see that they have a little bit of, they wobble a little bit. They have some variation in the colors on the back faces right there to give a really good sense of like space. And there are a couple of parameters that I added here as user parameters just to make my life easier. I'm going to show more details about this Niagara System setup later. For now, I'm going to show what I did on the material side. To begin with, we have our texture with the trails, and I just used like a rewrote node, like for the sake of clarity on the material, like just store that on this node here, just so for every texture sampler, I'm going to be like referencing that. Same thing here for the distortions. So imagine this is like the shapes of the trails. So what I do like is very like this part here is just very simple stuff. The idea is since we have like 5 different variations of the trail, we want to split the UVs in 5 parts. So for that, I get the V. We get like the vertical part of the UVs, like by getting like the V. We divide that by 5, which is the number of trails. And then by getting like a random value coming from the Niagara system, we can pick a random trail and display that on our ribbon. And for doing that, we just like multiply this random by the number of trails that we have. There's random value is normalized, so it comes between 0 and 1. So I multiply that by the trail count. Let's say we have like a number between 0 and 5. We round that down and we divide it back to 5. So it should give us an index between 0 and 4 or 5, depending on which number you get. Then you divide your V by this number, so it should be able to sample only one piece of the trails. And then you add the random, let's say, index as an offset. And you append that as the V part of the UVs. And for the R, we just multiply that by like a tiling value, so we can control how much details we have depending on the size of our ribbon. The next thing is just like very simple stuff. We just span that around to give some motion. There is a little bit special is, if you look at the reference, some pieces of the ribbon, you can tell that the texture is split on like 2 or 3 stripes. In order to achieve that kind of look, we can sample our trails a couple of times. In this case, I just did that twice. So what I do here is I sampled it once, and then I get our distortions that we saved on our texture. Like I use the distortions to distort the texture a little bit on that second sampler here, and then we get the max value between them. So if we crank up our distortions, you can see how this thing works exactly. So if I have no distortions, it behaves as a single ribbon. So if we put like, let's say 10, you will start seeing like the thing coming out. And of course, you have to be careful to not distort that too much to the point where like you can start seeing like the other trails from the other parts of the texture showing up on the edges. So just be mindful about that. Keeping at 3 should be like a good value. Some of the ribbons that you can see on the game, you can see that sometimes they're a little bit more noisier, sometimes they're like smoother. So for that, I just generated this noise based, like you can use like the noise node that comes with the material editor. And for the position, I'm using the UVs because I don't want that to be in screen space. So I use the UVs, I do some math here just to control like the timing of that they're not too stretched because like the ribbons are a lot thinner in comparison to their length. Control like the tiling here, then we get our noise. And what I do with the noise, I get this like this value. This value here is pretty much this texture here. So you can see that on the center of the ribbon, it's a little bit brighter. So I use that to mask our noise because I just want the noise to be like on the edges of the shape. So what I do is, let's come back to the material here. So I get that and I invert to use that as a mask to our noise. So the noise level would be like, you can control the noise level by a parameter here. So let's say if I increase that, you can see how the effect gets a little bit noisier. So I can control that. And the other thing, I use this core of the effect to mask that. I multiply that by itself so they get a little bit thinner. So you can kind of see that happening here. So I get the invert value and I multiply that by the noise. So that's gonna make sure that we only have noise on the edges here, if you look at that as a mask. The other thing is lerping, using this input as like this noise level input as a lerp. So what's gonna happen is where it's white, it's gonna get our noise texture, and where it's black, it's gonna get 1, and then we use that to multiply by our texture here. So we preserve the center of the shape. The other thing is, once we have like this gradient, we can use the simple trick to increase, like play with the contrast of our ribbons. So what I do here, I'm using a vector 2 because one of the remapped gradients are going to be used as an alpha, and the other one is going to be used to tweak the colors, to put some colors on the edges of the effect. And instead of like using 2 subtracts and 2 divides, I put them into vectors. So the cost of that's pretty much the same, and we can kind of like optimize that a little bit by doing that. So what I do, like I have an erosion value that's being passed by the Niagara system, and I subtract this erosion value from our gradient, and I divide that by some fall off value. So the lower this value, when you let's say when you divide a number by another number that is lower than 1, you're kind of like increase the value of that number, right? So by putting like a very low value, you pretty much crank up the contrast of that. And then you saturate so you don't have like very large negative numbers. And we can use that as our alpha, for example. And of course, like I just multiply here by the particle alpha, just so if we want to fade things out. And that's it for the shapes of our ribbons. And for the colors, what I do is, instead of having just the fall off here to divide, what I do is I get the inverted value of our erosion. By getting the invert value of the erosion as our fall off, we guarantee that we have a gradient that goes always from like 0 and 1, where 1 is the center and 0 is like where like the parts that are being eroded away. So we can break this vector 2 into 2 floats, and then the alpha goes to our alpha, and the Y value or the G value, there's like our color gradient goes to this other section of the material where we can use that to sample some colors. So what I do is just use like a simple power here just to change so it's just like, it's not like a linear gradient. I have a little bit of like a smooth curve to the edges. Also, like to be easy to tweak the colors on our Niagara system, I always do things that are relative to the particle color. So what I do is, by using the edges as a mask, I use that to lerp between like the particle color and the particle color multiplied by some like darker tone here. So that guarantees that our edges here are going to be a little bit darker than the core. And the other thing is we have our back color. So this guy here tells us how like the back of the effect is going to look like. So we can put like funky colors here, and it's going to change only the back side. And the rest is just like controlling like the brightness and putting like a power just to make the colors a little bit more sweet. And the last part of the color part of the material is this eye adaptation invert. It just guarantees that no matter the exposure value of the post effects of the level, the colors are going to be consistent. Because this thing is unlit, and it's supposed to be just like an emissive material. We don't really want like the intensity of the sunlight or whatever camera settings to be like changing these colors. For example, if we just remove that, you can see that it's way brighter than what it's supposed to be. Coming back here to this shadow part of the ribbons, this part I'm calculating here. So what I do is I get the center of the effect and the word position and transform them to view space. That guarantees that no matter the angle there I'm looking at, the back faces are always going to be in the back. So because it's using like the camera space, I use that, and then I use the Z value or like the B, like you can mask the B here. This is like the Z value in view space, and by subtracting that, I can get like a gradient that goes like from the center to the back and front. And what I do is I divide that by the radius, also multiplied by the lifetime of the particle, just because like on the animation, the effect starts as a really tiny core and then expands. So I want this radius to be changing over time, right? So I have this radius, I divide this distance, so that should normalize the distance and give us like a range between like 0 and 1. And then I remap that because like the front of the effect is going to have like some negative or positive values, and then the back is going to be like the opposite. So I remap that back to 0 and 1, saturate that, just make sure that we're not going to be having like very bright colors in the front. Like use the power just to tweak the gradient, and this thing actually works pretty well in giving us like what phases are in the back and what are on the front, as I can show here. Global tiling, shadow gradient. If we just display this guy here, you can see what I'm talking about. So there isn't a lot of mystery on what I did for the distortions. So pretty much I just sampled the texture twice just to have like a slight variation on the tiling, which you can see here. Like one of those samples are going to be used to control like the variation across the ribbon, like how early some parts of the ribbon are going to erode away, or where exactly like the distortions are going to be masked. And the second sampler are the actual distortions. So for that, like I just have like a different tiling value for each of them, which I multiply by the U of the UVs. And only the U because I don't really want to tile the V part. The V part, I want them to be like the same value on the bottom and the top of the ribbon. So for that, instead of using the V, I just use a random value. Depending on our ribbon, we're going to be picking like a random cross section of our texture that's going to give us this consistent value on the bottom and the top, while having variation on the left and right corners of our ribbon. For the masking part, since it's only for the sake of variation, we don't really need to offset over time. But for our deformation, we kind of want to do that. So I just have a value for the offset speed in U and V, append them together, just so like the values are a little bit easier to tweak. And I use a panner node. And here, remember that we put our distortions on the green and blue channel of the texture, so we append them together and subtract by half. So because our distortions are on the texture, they go like from 0 and 1, so we subtract, so we get them to minus half and half. And then we multiply by some intensity to tell like how much we want to actually deform our effect. For that, we have our distortions, And also I'm passing some distortion values from the Niagara system, so just in case we want to animate that over time. Then I multiply that by our directions. I mask the distortions using the blue channel of the texture. If you look at the blue and the green channel, they're pretty much just like, they look a lot like Berlin noise, whereas the alpha value is like an actual Berlin noise, but with like a way less variation. What I do is I use the alpha to control the erosion of the effect. So if we follow like this reroll here, our variety mask, I'm using that here on the dissolve. So pretty much I'm just controlling, I have like another parameter here that controls how much I want things to like start earlier than the rest, to start dissolving earlier than the rest. I use my mask for that, and I just add that to the erosion value that I'm passing to our dissolve part of the shader. And the other thing that I do is I just use our UVs to find like the edges of the effect. And there isn't much mystery here. Just grab like the U value, remap that, invert, get like those type of like look on your preview, and you just add that to your erosion as well. That guarantees that the edges will always be eroded. There are two things that I'm doing with my distortions. The first of them is to just mask that using the mask that I had previously mentioned, and adding that to our like trails texture sample UV, so we can deform them and do like the split function that I have mentioned. And the other thing is using the same like distortion values to use some word position offset. And here what I do is I just make a vector tree out of that. Also remap that to -1 and 1 by doing like subtract and multiply. What like the fancy thing that I had to do here was to transform that from like tangent to view space, like swap some channels around, and then transform back to word space before using that as a word position offset. And the idea behind that is that that normal map is actually sampled in, let's say, tangent space because it's on the UVs. Just connecting that straight to the word position offset won't guarantee that the mesh is going to be deformed in the directions that I want. So the plan was to make sure that no matter the angle that you're going to be looking at your ribbons, the offsets are going to be making the ribbons go like up and down and right and left. So if I rotate the mesh here, you can kind of see, if I also crank this thing up, let's put it here like 200 for example, you see that the deformations are always pointing like to the sides and up and down, no matter this like the angle that I look at. If I don't do that, if I just have this vector as is and connect that to my like offset, it's gonna look all funky. It will only offset to the sides depending on the angle you're looking at. It's not gonna look super great. So by doing that, you just guarantee that it's gonna look good always. Again, like I just multiply that by this parameter being passed by the Niagara system, so we can animate that and use a reroll node here. This thing goes straight to our word position offset. So having all that, I can show exactly how I'm using that on the Niagara system. So the whole setup for this Niagara system is done with a single emitter. Of course, the original effect has many parts of that I didn't really dive too much into for the sake of keeping things simpler for the tutorial. So the first thing we can check out is the emitter update. So what I'm doing here, if you just right click here and add an emitter and just create like a dynamic beam, you'll see that it's going to create a few modules for us. Like this thing is meant to work as a beam, and what we want to do is slightly different. We want to customize that, so I'm going to replace some of those modules while keeping a few just for the sake of like just having things already set up for us. So I'm going to delete this one. I kept the beam emitter setup. This thing, it grabs like a beam start and end position. So what I did here, I just put like it starts like on 0, 0, 0 as well, like this like simulation position, and it ends on the same position. So if we have only that, all the particles from the ribbon are going to be like in a single point. So after that, I can start adding positions as I wish. So still on the emitter update, we have the spawn versus spontaneous. So what I did here is, in order to have this spiral effect, I used a sphere emitter, like sphere shape emitter, and I need a very specific number of particles to be spawned in order for the spirals to work in the way I want. So I had to make user parameters that go both on the spawn burst instantaneous module, also like passing the same values to our shape location. So here what I did was I just multiplied our number of like spiral count number with our particle count, like, and then convert that back to an integer. That gave us like the right amount of particles to work with. And the other thing that I'm doing is just creating, for every frame, I'm creating a new random value. So when I spawn all those particles to make the ribbon, they just save that to another particle parameter, so I can use that consistently across the ribbon. If I just use random values, it's going to be random for each piece of the ribbon. It's going to break all the effects, so I use that to have like randomization while keeping things consistent across the ribbon. But coming back to this spawn burst, so what I do with the spiral count and the particle count, I use that on our shape location. Since like the beam emitter is gonna spawn them all in a single point, I can use that to start adding offsets. So what it does, it's gonna like add positions to our particles based on this sphere shape. So what I do here, like I can control how big the whole effect starts by using like the sphere radius. So this is the math that I found to spawn the particles on a spiral shape. You can take a look. You can pause and take a look at the math here. I achieved that by just tweaking some values, like playing around the math until something worked out. Maybe there is like a better simplification for that, but this is what worked. So the other thing that I do is I add velocity from a point, just so like over time the particles are gonna be moving outwards on our effect. Another important thing about that is that like the velocity is being passed randomly. In order for that to work, I had to use a very low number of particles and rely a lot on the interpolation between the particles to have like the smooth shapes between them on the ribbon. So, for example, if I have way too many particle counts for each part of the spiral, if I have, let's say, 150, there are going to be like too much variation on those speeds and the effect doesn't work. So I keep this value low. And in order to have like this smooth shapes, I have to come here on the renderer and set the tessellation option to custom. And then it's always like, just for the sake of the tutorial, they're going to like stress too much about the poly count. You have to have a constant tessellation factor between the particles, and also there won't be too much variation on the distance of them because they are spawned like evenly spaced out, so don't stress too much about that. In order to do that, you just need to check this use constant factor here and put whatever value works for you. And another thing, like looking at the reference, you can kind of see that the shapes are a little bit angular. They're not like super smoothly round on the edges. So to achieve that, you have this option here to have the curve tension. So if you put 0, your shapes are going to be very smooth, and by putting a lot of tension, they're going to be very sharp. I feel like having them sharper than smoother just makes them look more like what's in the actual game, but this is like depending on your taste. I leave that somewhere around here, and it kind of looks great. The other thing is just having like a user parameter to control the width of the ribbon by using the beam width. And the only thing special that I do here, I use our constant random particle value to lerp between the width and the width like multiplied by some factor, so it's a little bit thicker. And I use a random range as the alpha value of the lerp. So I get a random number between 0 and our randomness. So if the randomness is 0, it will always use this input from the lerp. If the randomness is 1, it's going to give us a random value between those two. And then coming back to our particle update, there isn't much fancy stuff going on. I mean, I do change the colors over time. Since I'm applying like a height speed at the beginning, I use some drag to have the particles slowing down, so they start fast and they end up slowly. And if I increase the drag, you kind of like can see what it does. If I have no drag, it just goes flying away. Here I use the curve as in the intensity of our curl noise, so over time they just stops offsetting the particles, just so they don't go too crazy. And by controlling the scale of the curve, I can tell how much curl noise I want to apply to this effect. If I put 0, it's going to look a little bit flat. It still has a little bit deformation from the word position offset, but if I crank that up, then you can start seeing some crazy things going on the effect. So yeah, don't need to use too much of that because the word position offset's already doing a big chunk of the work. because we're not using the beam modules that I mentioned before, we like this curve noise will not update the beam. Like we don't have the beam update here, because if we do, it's going to transform the whole thing into a beam and it's going to break the effect. It doesn't even work if I enable that. So I don't want to use the thing that comes by default, so I want to update the position of the beam manually. So what I do is, like this curve noise is going to be outputting a parameter on our system, and you can check that by clicking here and go like to show parameter writes. And you can see that the curve noise module is writing to this output curve noise force. And what I do is I manually add that to the position of the ribbons here. So first we have like the soul forces and velocity. This is going to take care of the speed over time and the drag and everything else. But for this curve noise, I have to just add that manually for some reason. So I use the set function here. So what I do here, I set the particle position manually. And what I do is I add something on top of that. So I have the particle positions here, and I add our curve noise that we just saw that that module is writing on this output. So we add that. And the other thing I do is I add another vector. And this vector is just like a direction pointing up. Then I transform that from word to simulation, just in case, like if this effect right now is in local position. So depending on the rotation of the effect, I want them to go like move upwards. That's why I'm transforming that to our simulation, like from word to simulation space. And what I do is I multiply this direction by a speed. And this speed is multiplied by our delta time. So we can just pass the speed on as a parameter here. And so if I put that, let's say 200, our effects are going to be floating upwards. Or if I put minus 150, it's going to go downwards. Put 0, it's just going to stay in place. But this is another thing you can just play around. If you tweak this formula here, like right now it's just like a constant speed, but you can implement some physics formulas here and have gravity working and that kind of stuff. And the last part of the effects is just the dynamic parameter that we had seen on our shader editor. And here is what I'm doing. I'm just passing an erosion over time, not very complicated, and a distortion, and then the same value that I'm using as like a random value all across the ribbon, I'm passing that to the shader, just so I also have like a random value there I can use to tweak things. Like this is what makes us like pick a different trail texture on our sprite sheet and that kind of stuff. And other than that, I just passed the spiral factor. This spiral factor, it just tells how many spirals we have on the ribbon, and depending on how many spirals the ribbon is gonna get longer. And when the ribbon gets longer, we have to change the tiling of the textures inside the shader. So to not keep tweaking that back and forth by when I change the size of the ribbons, I just pass that to the shader. And then on the shader, we just store like, let's say a global tiling value. It's pretty much just grabbing our spirals count. And that global value is, if you double click that, you can see where it's been used. And I just have all our tiling values that I'm using across the shader are just being multiplied here. If you have any specific questions, feel free to leave a comment. You can also check out more of our Level Up series on our channel. Thank you for watching.